Alright, if you watched the previous videos, you should now know how Bitcoin mining works, and so the only question remaining is why? Why do we need to spend so much energy? Why is it so complicated? And what's the point of doing it this way? Well, we need Bitcoin mining because all decentralized networks suffer from the problem that's known as the Byzantine generals problem. It's a computer science problem that tries to describe how distributed networks can reach a consensus. And the original form goes like this. You have a bunch of generals that try to overthrow an evil king living in his castle. And they can only win if they all attack at the same point in time. And so the generals need to send messages to each other to determine when to attack. However, the evil king will try to deceive them by sending false messages and by intercepting their messengers, killing them or bribing them to alter the message. And so I think the original solution is that each general just sends multiple messengers to every other general, and they then just assume that the king will not be able to kill all the messengers or bribe them, and so the general receiving the messages can just take the most common message to be true, and this way they can communicate with each other and reach a consensus. Now in Bitcoin, you also need to reach a consensus on which blockchain is the correct one. And you also have a lot of different nodes or generals, and some of those are bad actors that will try to deceive, lie and steal. And so one way an attacker could try to steal from others is what's known as the double spend. Let's assume Bob here owns one Bitcoin, but he wants to spend it twice. One way he could do this is by sending two valid transactions at the same time. Now both stores would receive the transaction if he sends it directly to their nodes, and they would then check and see, okay, Bob has one Bitcoin and he has sent it to my address. And if they immediately then approve the transaction and deliver the goods to Bob, he could spend the same Bitcoin twice, because it takes a certain amount of time for the transaction to travel through the network and arrive at the other store. And the other problem is that it would split the network into two, because if those nodes that receive the orange transaction first would receive the blue one, they would think the blue one is invalid, as for them Bob has already spent his Bitcoin in store 2. And the other side of the network would reject the orange transaction because, as far as they're concerned, Bob already spent his Bitcoin in the blue transaction. And to avoid this, we need Bitcoin mining. Because this way, everyone only accepts the transaction once it has been included in a block. And so if Bob would send two different transactions, one side of the network would try to create a new block with the blue transaction, and the other side of the network would try to create a new block with the orange transaction. And since mining a block is basically a game of chance, one side would be faster. And let's say the blue ones find a block first, they would then send out the new blue block to everyone in the network. Everyone would check that the blue block is valid and add it to their blockchain. And so since now everyone agrees that the blue transaction is valid, everyone will reject the orange transaction, and Bob can no longer double spend his Bitcoin. Now let's look at what would happen if just by chance both sides of the network were to find a new block at about the same time. Then both would broadcast their newest block to everyone else, and it would create what's called a fork, because everyone would realize that both blocks are valid, and so it would kind of create this fork in the blockchain. And what happens next would be that the whole process simply continues, because now all the miners decide whether they want to build their newest block on top of the blue block or on top of the orange one. Because as you remember, every block is linked to exactly one previous block. And so whoever would find the newest block first would then add it to the blue one or to the orange one, and this chain would then become the longest chain. And in Bitcoin, the longest chain is always the valid one. And so whoever finds the new block first determines which chain will continue on, because as soon as someone finds a new block, let's say on top of the orange one, everyone mining on the blue side realizes that it is in their economic interest to switch over and also try to find a new block that builds on top of this new one that was added to the orange block, because only transactions in the valid side of the chain are accepted by other people, and so mining on this side still costs the miners energy, but their reward transactions will not be acknowledged by other people in the network. Only if they mine on this side of the network and add to the longest chain will the other people recognize the reward transactions as valid, and so everyone switches as fast as possible to the longest chain. And with this we can also look at another attack, the 51% attack. And to be honest, I think this might have been a problem or a possible threat to Bitcoin in the beginning, but now that Bitcoin uses this much energy and it is distributed all over the globe, I don't think it's realistic. But just for completion, let's also look at how a 51% attack would work. It assumes that someone is able to get at least 51% of all the compute power in the network, which again is very unrealistic. But let's say Bob gets 51% of all the hash power. He would then send out the first blue transaction and would let everyone try to find the blue block, while he himself is trying to build an alternative block with the second transaction. And so once the blue block is found and broadcasted to everyone in the network, and the store number one thinks that Bob paid them 1 Bitcoin in this transaction, and they send the goods to Bob, he then publishes the orange block, causing a fork in the network. And he also builds as fast as possible on top of the orange block. And since he has more compute power than everyone else, he is expected to find blocks faster than the other people in the network, and so his chain will become the longest one, which then means that now the orange block is considered valid, and so store number 2 will also think that Bob paid them 1 Bitcoin and deliver the goods to him. And theoretically, Bob could also add fake transactions. Let's say he would assign himself 100 Bitcoin just for the fun of it, and if he manages to create the longest chain, which is possible if he has 51% of all the computing power, then these 100 Bitcoin that he just assigned to himself would also be considered valid. But the thing is, this would create a giant scandal, and somehow people will either find a way to reject Bob spending those new 100 Bitcoins, or Bitcoin would go to zero. And so it makes no sense for Bob to try to destroy the Bitcoin network, because then his 100 Bitcoin would also be worthless. And if you have so much money that you can afford to 51% attack the network, why don't you just use all this money and buy whatever you wanted to buy with the fake Bitcoin in the first place? And so I think the 51% attack doesn't make sense anymore. Alright, and now you know why we need Bitcoin mining, because it solves the Byzantine generals problem and allows the network to reach a consensus on the current state of the blockchain. I hope you by now also realize that Bitcoin's energy usage is actually a feature and not a bug, because it links the digital world to the physical one, where you need to pay a lot of money to buy miners and pay electricity bills. And this prevents a lot of attacks and makes Bitcoin so secure. And if you ever receive a large amount for payment, you now know that it makes sense to maybe wait a couple of blocks until you ship the goods, just to make sure that you're in the longest chain and the transaction is actually valid. And so with that, thank you for watching, and until next time.